What if I told you there's a town where the ground has been on fire for over 60 years, and the air people breathe there could slowly kill them? Daniel, a teacher in his 40s, stepped out of his house just before sunrise as the cold air cut through his face like a blade, and his car stood outside covered in a thin layer of ice while he carried his bag in one hand and a cup of hot coffee in the other, trying to hold on to some warmth before starting his day. Knowing that the drive to school should only take 10 minutes, but in weather like this, those 10 minutes could easily feel much longer. Daniel got into his car and gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling that familiar frustration building up, because it wasn't just about work or the loud students or even the long day ahead. What he hated the most was the road itself, frozen, slippery, and completely unpredictable, where one small mistake could cost everything. So he muttered quietly that he hated this winter and wished it would just disappear, without realizing that somehow, in a way he could never expect, that wish would actually come true. Across town, Sarah was finishing her shift at the local hospital, a place known for treating coal miners since most people in the town had worked in the mines at some point in their lives. But recently, something had changed, because the number of patients had increased dramatically, and not because of injuries or accidents, but due to something far more unusual, like constant headaches, breathing problems, and extreme exhaustion. And earlier that same day, she had treated a 9-year-old girl who could barely breathe, which was not something she was used to seeing in children, and it certainly wasn't the only case. Later that night, Sarah drove home through the quiet streets, but something felt off as she noticed that the roads, which were usually frozen solid during winter, were completely clear with no ice at all, and even the air felt warmer than it should have been. And when she stepped out of the car, she caught a faint smell in the air, something strange and unfamiliar, not strong enough to alarm her, but noticeable enough to make her pause for a moment before eventually ignoring it and going inside. Inside the house, her husband was searching through drawers in frustration, asking about the headache pills, and when she told him she had bought them yesterday, he looked at her in confusion and told her that she hadn't, because it had actually been over a week. And that's when she realized that the pressure at work, the never-ending number of patients, and the exhaustion were starting to affect her memory. And she wasn't the only one experiencing these symptoms. At school, Alex sat at his desk, holding his head, as another headache made it impossible for him to focus on his math exam. Not because he didn't want to study, but because he simply couldn't. And then suddenly whispers spread across the classroom as students began to talk about how Daniel had collapsed during class, causing the room to fall into complete silence. Over the next few days, more students and residents began complaining about the same symptoms, including headaches, fatigue, and other strange conditions that no one could fully explain. Until one day, the fire alarm suddenly went off, and the loud sound echoed through the entire school, sending students rushing through the hallways and outside the building within minutes, only to realize that there was no fire, no smoke, and no visible danger, which made many believe it was just a false alarm. But soon reports started coming from all over town about alarms going off inside homes without any clear reason. The real reason, however, was something far more dangerous, something invisible and deadly: carbon monoxide. On the edge of town, a man named Rick decided to leave the area for a while after suffering from constant headaches, so he walked away from buildings in search of fresh air. But even there, something felt wrong as he tried to take a deep breath and realized his lungs wouldn't fully expand, as if he could only breathe halfway. And despite that, he kept walking step by step until suddenly the ground beneath his feet gave way, and in an instant, he was falling into darkness. Everything that happened in this town could be traced back to a single moment in 1962, when firefighters were sent to burn trash in a landfill just outside the town, which at the time was considered a normal way to dispose of waste. So they lit the fire expecting it to burn out quickly, but it didn't, as days passed, and then weeks, and no matter how much water they used, the fire refused to go out. Eventually, they decided to dig deeper to understand what was happening, and what they discovered changed everything, because beneath the landfill there were deep cracks in the ground that led directly to an underground network of coal mines, and through those cracks the fire had spread down into the coal itself. Once coal catches fire underground, it becomes nearly impossible to stop, and the fire began to spread from one tunnel to another, and then to another, until the entire ground beneath the town was burning. The heat slowly rose to the surface, melting the snow, warming the air, and releasing toxic gases into the atmosphere, while at the same time making the ground unstable, so that some areas appeared completely normal on the surface, but were actually weak and fragile underneath, meaning that one wrong step could cause the Allard to collapse without warning and pull anyone straight into the burning tunnels below. Several accidents occurred as people fell into sudden sinkholes, and some of them never made it out, while the gases released underground explained everything that had been happening, because carbon monoxide, which is invisible and deadly, was the real cause behind the headaches, the exhaustion, and the breathing problems. At that point, it became clear that the town was no longer safe to live in, and eventually the truth came out as residents discovered what had been happening beneath their feet, which led them to take legal action against the authorities. And after a long struggle, they won, forcing the government to make a difficult decision, not to stop the fire because that was nearly impossible, but to evacuate the town instead. Homes were bought, buildings were abandoned, and families left one by one, until the town that was once full of life became almost completely empty. And today, Centralia stands as a nearly abandoned place where nature has slowly taken over. Yet beneath the surface, the fire is still burning, and experts believe it could continue burning for another 100 years.